Today's episode of Hidden Forces is made possible by listeners like you. For more information about this week's episode or for easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you listen to the show on your Apple Podcast app, remember, you can give us a review. Each review helps more people find the show and join our amazing community. And with that, please enjoy this week's episode. What's up, everybody? My guests on this week's episode of Hidden Forces are philosophers Brandon Warmke and Justin Tosi. They are the authors of a new book titled Grandstanding, which they define as, quote, the use and abuse of moral talk for the purposes of self-promotion. The book describes a spectacle that has become increasingly prevalent in and destructive to public discourse. And though it's most commonly associated with those on the political left, the practice of grandstanding is an entirely bipartisan phenomenon. For moral grandstanders, it isn't the pursuit of virtue that motivates them. They're not concerned with doing good. They're concerned with looking good. They want others to think that they are morally superior, and they're willing to go to great lengths in order to do it, including using moral talk as a tactic for punishment and intimidation. The irony is that grandstanders accomplish all of this by free-riding on the moral behavior and good intentions of others. They turn civil discourse into an arms race, weaponizing language and silencing their enemies with threats of doxing and humiliation. In this sense, the marketplace of ideas suffers today from a tragedy of the commons. Grandstanding pollutes the information landscape by incentivizing bad moral behavior at the expense of the common good. If you believe that civil discourse is important and that we need to be able to propose new ideas, challenge existing beliefs, and come to common resolutions about moral questions, then you have to be concerned about this issue. Our society is currently going through a seismic transition. Norms are being radically upended, and Americans are experiencing levels of political polarization arguably unseen since at least the 1970s. If we want to make it through this period in one piece, as one nation, undivided, we need to reclaim the moral high ground in our discourse. Otherwise, I'm afraid we're in danger of losing control of our country to the darker forces of our nature, and this would not bode well for the future of the Republic. And with that, please enjoy this timely and thoughtful conversation with my guests, Brandon Warmke and Justin Tosi. Brandon Warmke and Justin Tosi, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Demetri, thanks for having us.
Yep, great to be here.
So just so our listeners don't get mixed up, guys, who is who? Brandon, why don't you just say hi for a second so our listeners know who is Brandon and who is Justin?
Yeah, this is Brandon calling in from Ohio. Justin, I probably have, if you hear a little bit of a southern drawl, I probably have it. It's probably not Justin's.
So I'd love to, we don't usually get an opportunity to have two guests on at the same time. It's always fun for me, but I think in every prior instance that I've done this, I've done it in person in our studio, which makes it a bit easier. Before we get into this conversation, which I'm really looking forward to doing, maybe you can give our listeners a sense of your backgrounds each. So why don't we start with Brandon? Why don't we start with you?
Sure. I grew up in Indiana and never really had any intention of being a philosopher. I think like a lot of philosophers, it just sort of, you catch the bug somehow. You take a college class and you end up loving philosophy. So I didn't study philosophy in undergrad. I actually studied religion. And I went to grad school, did a master's degree in Illinois, and then I started a PhD at Florida State and then transferred to the University of Arizona, and that's actually where I met Justin. We overlapped during our PhD.
Yeah, I heard you guys bonded over nachos.
It's funny. We did a previous podcast. It was one of the earlier ones in promo for the book. And after we got done, Justin said, "You talked about nachos too much."
Hey, I was going to ask if that was a prerequisite for doing philosophy or just moral philosophy.
Well, it's a prerequisite for doing philosophy in Tucson, Arizona. Yeah, I think that's just what happens down there.
And so, Justin, what about you?
Yeah, so I just want to say, I mean, at the end of that podcast, you're promoting a book. I mean, so you sometimes want to make sure people got, I mean, Brandon's takeaway message was really like, did you get that about the nachos? So I grew up in Yorktown, Virginia. It's in kind of the Williamsburg area. I did politics, really political theory and philosophy at the University of Virginia. And that's sort of a weird program there. They do political theory like philosophers do political philosophy. So I ended up mistakenly in a political science PhD program until I figured out that was not really a good fit for me. And then I moved to Arizona to just normal philosophy with Brandon. And then we both discovered that we had enough, I guess, of weird performative moral talk from people on Facebook back then. And we got to complaining about that. And all these years later, here we are.
Performative moral talk. What is that?
So, I mean, that was sort of how we were talking about it back then. It was just a thing where, you'd go online and you'd see normal people, some of them academics, some of them just people we knew, talking in the form of almost like a corporate press release when they've done something wrong, where, they've got to make a really clear demonstration of what their values are and assure everyone that their heart's in the right place. And, they feel really strongly about this. And, we saw so much of this. We're like, what are these people doing? Do they think they're accumulating points somehow? So, over a couple of years of kind of every once in a while, getting together and complaining about this, we started to think maybe there's a fun philosophy paper to write here because, we see this stuff and we take these people less seriously. We think like, is this what, everybody's doing when they talk about, do they actually care about morality? So this performative aspect of what we were seeing really rubbed us the wrong way. And we came to find out it rubs a lot of other people the wrong way too. Brandon, I mean, is that kind of how you remember feeling about this?
Yeah, we started talking about, this was 2014, we started talking about the way, and at the time a lot of it was academics, but I think it started seeping into larger public discourse too. It seemed to us anyway, we're using a lot of public discourse to make themselves look good. They didn't seem primarily interested in like talking about the real issues or trying to figure out the truth, although a lot of times it's cloaked in those kinds of sort of sheepskins. But a lot of times it seemed like that what they were doing was trying to impress other people and seek status. And so this is 6 years ago. I mean, it's like almost like quaint now what we were seeing then compared to what we see now. And so we decided over the next few years, we wrote a paper called Moral Grandstanding that got published. And then we sort of writing this book for Oxford. And in the meanwhile, we did a lot of psychological research. And, what we found out, this is not going to be a surprise for a lot of people, is, your podcast is named Hidden Forces. As it turns out, one of these sort of really quiet poisons or hidden forces in public discourse is our desire to impress others, our desire to seek status. And one easy way to do that when you're on Twitter or when you're on Facebook, when you have a platform of hundreds or thousands of people, is to try to morally impress people. Most of us think we're better than average morally. We give ourselves pretty high moral grades. And, it's really easy to fall into the trap of wanting feedback and affirmation for how good we think we are from like-minded people in our tribe. And so there's this really strong temptation, this sort of quiet poison in our public discourse that's driving a lot of what we see.
So there are different types of grandstanding. I'm just thinking one, for example, that isn't contingent on being moral or pointing to some type of virtue is if you're trying to sound smart. Or I sort of imagine in my head, like, technobabble or something like that. How do you guys define grandstanding? And am I correct to differentiate between types of grandstanding as in categorical differences, moral grandstanding, sort of intellectual grandstanding, et cetera?
Yeah, so attempts to impress other people are pretty common. As you rightly point out, you can try to impress people with how smart you are, or maybe, how well educated you are, maybe your athletic prowess. Grandstanding, you can think of it as a kind of like broad term. You could intellectually, spiritual grandstanding, for people who grew up in kind of spiritual backgrounds, there's a kind of one-upsmanship that can occur in religious contexts. But so you're right that there's different domains, as it were, of grandstanding. We're interested in the moral domain, where what people are doing is they're saying something in public discourse because they have a strong desire to impress other people. And typically these contributions happen in conversations about morality and politics. And, lots of sort of bragging or grandstanding is, fairly innocent. If you're bragging about your income over dinner or something, or you're trying to impress people with your education, a lot of times that's fairly benign. But, in our view, when we sort of switch over to the context of discussing, morality and politics, these really important issues, talking about public shaming and public policy, these things can really affect hundreds or millions of lives. The stakes are raised. And so, how we treat public discourse really matters. It's a really valuable resource, and it can be protected. It can be sustained. We can treat it well, or we can destroy it.
It's worth pointing out, too, this is not a rare thing, of course. I mean, not only is it not rare to have people trying to manage the impressions that others have of them in these various domains of life, like you point out, Demetri, but all of this springs from just pretty normal human psychology. So psychologists have figured out, done a lot of studies, people are self-enhancers for any trait that is positive and vague enough that they can maybe talk themselves into thinking they're exceptional in that way. People think that they're above average, even when there's some objective measure of this thing, and it turns out they are not above average. So we all engage in self-enhancement, and we engage in self-enhancement in particular when it comes to morality. We all want to think that we are morally better than average. We also engage in social comparison. And in fact, that's where a lot of this self-enhancement comes from. We understand ourselves partly in terms of how we measure up relative to other people. So we measure our worth by where we stand compared to them. You might think, I am, the most liberal or conservative of my friends, right? And then you might hear your friends, sounding actually very liberal or conservative, and you might still maintain this self-impression of where you stand. Well, I'm still, more liberal or conservative than them, and it works that way across lots of traits.
Yeah, I think you guys described that as a moral arms race, a phenomenon that we see in public. But, this is another question I have, actually two questions maybe, and then I really want to get into a strict definition of grandstanding, because one of the things that someone that would read your book might think at the outset, well, this seems unnecessarily pedantic or overly analytical, but I think actually, exactly, well, you guys are philosophers, but I think actually the exercise of taking such a fine-tooth comb to the subject, it helps, I think, illuminate the nature of the problem in a way that wouldn't be possible otherwise. In other words, taking such an epistemic perspective. And I think actually, even though this is a conversation about morality or where we stand in terms of morals, it highlights the epistemic crisis that we have in society, because I think it's difficult for a society to transition its values, and values are constantly changing, clearly, right? It's difficult to make that transition if you don't have a sort of clear definition of how to arrive at objective truth, and how to analyze things and how to reason through. But, two of the things that came to mind, and then take them as you will. One has to do with narcissism, because I think we live in a much more narcissistic society today, and I think the two of you have talked at length about this. And I wonder, to what extent does the fact that our society is so narcissistic contribute to this? Because, of course, the saying is, offense is taken, it's not given. So a society seems to be more likely to take offense. Also, with respect to grandstanding, and this could also lead us into the definition, because you guys gave an etymology for the word grandstanding, which was interesting, and I wasn't aware of it. Does grandstanding on some level depend on having a large enough audience, or can you grandstand to your spouse or to your friend or to a small group of dinner guests? Those are my two questions. And then we'll get
Yeah.
into the definition.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the term grandstanding dates back to the 1880s. It's a term was used to refer to baseball players. And you'd have these baseball players like out in the outfield, and what they would do is they would make these like really sort of purposeful, showy, circus-like catches. And these baseball reporters describe these players as the grandstand player, right? They were playing to the grandstand. So the idea is that they're trying to impress the watchful audience. So we use this term grandstanding that dates back to the 1800s, and we think it captures this idea of like playing to the crowd. Now, I think it's an interesting question, like, could you grandstand to your spouse? For some reason, at least to our ear, that sounds a bit sort of forced, like linguistically forced. We often use the term like high horsing or to describe sort of smaller context events. But the basic idea is that grandstanding occurs when someone is making or trying to make a contribution to public discourse. Where public discourse, I mean, there's no bright line to draw about what counts as public and private. So does it take 10 people, 5 people? I mean, we don't really have any idea. But we do think that the mechanisms that are at play in grandstanding, such as the desire to impress other people, the fear of being cast out as a black sheep by your own tribe, these very strong social motives, those are most in play when you have a large context. So when you're on Twitter, when you're on Facebook, when you're, a politician giving a stump speech, when you're a cable news host at night, I mean, these huge audiences, this is where the pressure really to try to seek prestige and try to impress other people, that's where those incentives really take hold. And so we think those are the clearest cases of grandstanding. So we try to fixate on those cases. Yeah. So could you grandstand with 5 people? Yeah, maybe you could, but maybe a better term might sort of latch on to those cases.
The
better.
audience is an important component. The availability and size of an audience is integral to the concept of grandstanding.
That's right. The grandstander, I mean, we can just jump right into the basic account very quickly. I mean, our very simple account of grandstanding is grandstanding occurs when you say something in public discourse in order to get your audience to believe something about you, namely that you are morally impressive. You have this desire for recognition. You want to be seen as on the side of angels. And so grandstanders treat public discourse as a vanity project. And so they're not, sometimes the audience is also myself. I'm also trying to convince myself that I'm a good person. But a lot of the time, it's this desire to be seen by others. One interesting sort of thought experiment is like what people would say if like hundreds of people wouldn't hear them, or like if there were no feedback. So, if on Twitter you couldn't get a like or a retweet, would people behave in the same way? And I think that thought experiment maybe reveals the extent to which maybe we aren't even aware of it, but that we really do care to get the approval of others, at least some others, not everyone.
If you remember, Brandon, actually, you might not have been on Twitter for this, but Twitter floated the idea at one point of taking away.
Oh yeah, what's the point
of advertising the number of likes, and people went ballistic.
What's the point? Yeah,
I mean, the common refrain was, "It's like they don't even understand why this is fun."
Yeah.
Well, in the book, you guys actually say, and I'm taking now a direct quote, the use of moral talk for the purposes of self-promotion. This is how you define grandstanding. It's the use of moral talk for the purposes of self-promotion. And then you say, to grandstand is to turn your moral talk into a vanity project, which you had just said there, Brandon. Justin, to that point, is a more vain society, a more narcissistic society. Is such a society more prone to grandstanding, in your estimation?
Well, yeah, great question. One of the things I think that has been most satisfying about this project for us is that we, for years had a lot of conjecture. It's, supported conjecture, but still conjecture about the relationship between grandstanding and narcissism and other things like this. We've now actually been able to do some social science of our own with Brandon's colleague at Bowling Green, Joshua Grubbs, a psychologist there. So we've done, I think, 7 studies now, and we have over 6,000 participants, big random samples. And one of the things that we found most clearly is that people who rate higher on a narcissism scale are more likely to engage in grandstanding, or at least to report motivations to engage in grandstanding. Now, I'm not aware of like trends in narcissism. So, is society becoming more narcissistic? I'm not sure about that.
In your own experience, subjectively, do you experience that?
Subjectively? Well, here's what I will say. I think that narcissistic traits are fostered more now than they might have been in the past. So it's easier than ever for a narcissist to find an audience of like-minded people to tell them how great they are, to agree with them, and lavish likes and retweets and whatever else on them, right? So you just go on social media and it's a narcissist playground. So if you ask just about the hard wiring, are people more narcissistic today? I don't know. And I guess that would be sort of surprising. But what I think is pretty clear, and I am comfortable just coming out and saying, is that we foster narcissism. We reward narcissism now, and in a way and on a scale that I think it's fair to say we haven't in the past. So it shouldn't be any surprise then that narcissism might seem more prominent.
Well, in an episode that I did with Jonathan Haidt, having read his book, well, I read The Righteous Mind also, which is an amazing book. And I don't know if he talked about this in that book, but I've conflated his work, everything together now, whatever I've read. But in the Coddling of the American Mind, he does talk about this. Perhaps he doesn't use the word narcissistic, but certainly in terms of the focus that we put on the individual and on how the individual feels. And if he or she, I think one of the phenomena he covers on college campuses is that students are encouraged to interpret events according to how those events or how those words make them feel. That's what matters. And actually, that kind of raises a separate question, which I'd love to talk about at some point, maybe not now, but maybe in the overtime, which is, what is it like to be philosophers, to practice philosophy, which is literally thinking for a living, and being professors in this environment today? I would be curious about that. But I have a question. This is something that really kind of gnawed at me as I was reading your book, because I actually make it a point not to spend too much time. Well, first of all, I really avoid mainstream news, certainly cable. I don't watch MSNBC, CNN. Yeah, Fox. I think those things are poison. It's like eating poison. Why would you do that? Why would you do that to yourself? And then I try not to spend too much time on social media, though Twitter is promotionally, it is good as a promotional vehicle. But just reading your book and trying to find, this morning was when I started trying to find examples on Twitter of grandstanding, and I felt myself getting enraged. And I spent an hour trying to come up with a thread to write to sort of put my thoughts out there, and I kept deleting. And eventually I was like, I can't tweet this shit. I'm terrified. I'm terrified of what I'm going to say. I'm terrified of what's going to come out of my mouth. But here's my first question related to this, which is, what is it that bothers us so much about people who grandstand? Why does that bother us so much? Is it the hypocrisy that we can't stand about it?
So that's a really, there's lots of potential explanations, and I think a lot of them sort of get pushed together. So here are a few. Justin might want to toss a few in. I do think, and the studies do show, that people really have a low tolerance for hypocrites. And so if you think that you identify a grandstander, it's actually very hard for various reasons to be certain that someone's grandstanding, which we can talk about. But, if you think you spot someone grandstanding and you actually think that they're not as good as they think they are, like, they think they're, God's gift to the poor or God's gift to the American factory worker. And like, look, this person is a morally mediocre person. I think that the hypocrisy really does drive us crazy. Now, of course, people in your own tribe may not see you as a hypocrite, right? Because they agree with your moral stance, right? They might cheer on your grandstanding. They think you're really doing the Lord's work. But so one reason grandstanding bothers us is because we see it in people who we sometimes believe aren't as good as they present themselves to be. Another reason that grandstanding is, I think, annoying is that it can feel like people are free riding on public discourse. So they're kind of cheating. They're kind of taking advantage of the rest of us. And we hate that. Humans hate being taken advantage of. So here's the idea. Look, public discourse is this really valuable resource. It's like a public commons. And we all have access to it. And it's a really valuable tool for making the world better. But it's only a valuable tool. It's only effective when we take care of it, when we tend to it, when we decide to contribute, we don't poison it, we don't trash it, we don't destroy it. So when we all follow some sort of basic norms about how to treat public discourse, it can be a more or less valuable resource, an effective way to improve the world and identify problems and make changes and so on. So Justin and I are like totally into public discourse. We're totally into moral talk. We think it's super valuable. So when we condemn grandstanding, we're not saying moral talk is bad. What we're trying to do is preserve it. And I think when people engage in public discourse to sincerely identify wrongs or help other people, that's great. But what grandstanders do is they exploit the fact that other people are all following these rules. And also, they're trying to get these sort of selfish motivations. They're trying to get credit for themselves. So they're kind of exploiting, using other people in their sort of sincere following of the social and moral norms for discourse. But what grandstanders do is, and they're very sneaky about it, is they cloak their vain, self-seeking, sort of dominating moral talk. They cloak it in these sort of high-minded moral terms and these, cliches and platitudes. What they're really doing is trying to get themselves status, make themselves look good. And I think a lot of people who recognize that grandstanders do this just find this disgusting because they can see that they're not playing fair. They're being disrespectful and they're free riding on the rest of us. They're not doing their bit to restrain themselves in public discourse for the betterment of everybody else.
So and then Justin, I want to have you chime in here. Absolutely. I think the selfish component is so essential. And there are a few things that this raises. You said something about, is moral discourse important or moral talk important? I absolutely do want to delineate between moral talk and grandstanding, because I think that's actually sort of one of the most important points of your work and of the book. Because yes, there are these wolves in sheep's clothing that walk around and sort of free ride on moral discourse, and they do it for personal, selfish reasons, which we despise, which I also would like to get into because you have a great conversation about virtue in the book and what is a virtuous way to do moral talk. And there is something, sort of disgusting about people that do that, and I think it's important to be able to identify them, because I think right now one of the things that's happened is these individuals, in many instances, have hijacked the conversation, and they have caused a kind of moral arms race escalation to the point where the entire landscape is littered and it's replete with minefields, and people that are moderates or well-intentioned people that want to have moral conversations in order to move society forward, which I think is an important part of, social cohesion. As I mentioned earlier on, values constantly change. So this is important, this idea of how to do moral talk. But before we actually do any of that, I want to differentiate one more thing, because people are not familiar with, they're familiar with the word grandstanding in that we all have heard that word, but it doesn't have contemporary relevance the way the phrase virtue signaling does. And so, what is grandstanding? And maybe, Justin, you want to take this? I don't know.
Sure, yeah.
How does grandstanding relate to virtue signaling for people that are listening?
Good. So let me start. This will be an answer full of distinctions. So let me start with moral talk, and then we'll get to virtue signaling. So Brandon said in the last answer, we really need moral talk. It's really important. So when we, in this book talk about moral talk, what we mean is, people talking about figuring out what the right thing is together, like talking about it. What does justice demand? If you really love your country, what should you do? So when we engage in moral talk, we're, in public, at least we're very often talking about really important issues. And it's important that we be able to communicate clearly, with each other, take each other seriously, and, all be in it for, the right goal, that is of figuring out what the right thing to do is, and maybe even getting people to do it. So grandstanding is moral talk in this way, but it's an abuse of moral talk. So when people grandstand, they're pitching in, like chipping in, throwing in their own 2 cents in these conversations, but they're not just using the terms, right? They are using them with the goal of getting other people to think that they are morally impressive or, at least morally passable, decent people in some way. So what's the difference between grandstanding and virtue signaling? So virtue signaling is maybe a more popular term right now among people who are familiar with these sorts of issues and talk about them in public. We think that virtue signaling is not the right term for the behavior that we have in mind, and that I think most people have in mind when they talk about showy moral talk. So here are 2 problems. One is that a lot of this moral talk, like made with the intention of impressing other people, isn't actually about virtue at all. So virtue is typically thought to be an excellence of character. So to be virtuous, to be extreme in some way, to be extremely honest, extremely kind. But a lot of the time when people are grandstanding, they aren't trying to like stand out exactly. Sometimes they're just trying, and maybe even this is the more common thing, they're just trying to keep up, right? They want to say, look, I respect women. Look, I've made mistakes in my life. I have disrespected, the women around me, but even I know, this guy's behavior is out of line. So that's grandstanding. It has nothing to do with virtue. That person's not claiming to be virtuous.
It's more fear-induced grandstanding.
Often, yeah. So, grandstanding for self-protection is not plausibly about virtue. The signaling thing is actually the bigger problem, I think. So if you complain about virtue signaling, you're kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because signaling is just anything that communicates, right? So signaling can be, like an Instagram influencer taking a staged photo, trying to show that they were involved in protests, when they weren't. Or signaling can also just be someone writing a dry as dust philosophy paper about what's right and wrong, or someone just trying to figure out, amongst their friends, what's the right thing to do here. So we don't object to either of those things, because even though they communicate something about what, the person and what they believe, they're not driven by that person wanting other people to be impressed by them. So the point then in saying virtue signaling isn't the right idea here is, again, it's an overbroad charge. We're not worried about signaling. We're worried about people manipulating their moral talk and others with this one goal in mind, which is really just inappropriate.
Well, there actually, you guys differentiate between 2 types of grandstanding. One, I think you call it grandstanding to dominate others, and the other one is grandstanding to gain prestige. It's a little bit different than what we're talking about here, right? Because neither one of those is generated by fear. They're both opportunistic types of grandstanding.
Yeah, so there's lots of different ways of thinking about the specific kinds of motives that grandstanders have. So, I just want to dovetail on Justin's last point about virtue signaling, then I'll bring this back around to the other kinds of motives that one could have. So one thing we've noticed, the virtue signaling conversation has been one of the most frustrating things in talking about our work. When we started writing the paper, the term virtue signaling hasn't really even made its way onto the public scene. I mean, this was like 2014. It's hard to imagine a world in which virtue signaling wasn't a term, but it wasn't. It kind of showed up in 2015 and 16. And so we were kind of taken aback that there was this new term. And we do think it's a lot of people, when they use the term virtue signaling, they are trying to talk about what we call grandstanding. I think that's certainly true. But the term itself is misleading for ways that Justin mentions. And here's often what happens. Like, people will say something like, Tosi and Warmke, these guys, they're accusing people of grandstanding and virtue signaling. But what's wrong with virtue signaling? Like, if I help a little old lady across the street, like, I'm showing my virtue. What could possibly be wrong with that? And so there's this kind of slide between what we care about, which is, people intentionally trying to impress others with their moral talk. There's this natural, inevitable slide to like, what's wrong with doing virtuous things in public? Our complaint is not with doing actually virtuous things in public. That's not what we, do all the virtuous things you want in public. The thing that we are worried about is people treating public discourse as a way to impress other people with how good they think they are and all the problems that it causes. Now, you mentioned prestige and dominance. It turns out that if you look at the social psychology, we draw on this work of this psychologist at Stanford, Joey Chang, and what she shows is that there's two sort of basic ways that the humans try to seek social status. And just got to say, seeking social status is like maybe sex and like eating. Like seeking social status is one of the most basic, fundamental human desires there are. And what Joey Chang argues is that there's really two different ways that humans try to get status. One of them is trying to get status through prestige. And prestige is basically, you want people to think well of you. You want people to think that you're knowledgeable, that you have skills, that you're maybe important. And in many ways, there's, perfectly innocent ways of gaining prestige. I mean, a world-class tennis player has social prestige because they have this expertise and everyone knows who they are. The other way to get status is through what Chang calls dominance. And so dominance is a bit darker. Person striving prestige wants people to think well of them. They, a lot of in our work, what we found is that people who seek prestige in public discourse, they tend to be narcissistic extroverts. So they want to be, people look up to them and think of them as exemplars and that sort of thing. But people who grandstand for dominance, this is a much darker suite of psychological traits and activities. So people who grandstand for dominance, they want to, instead of be lifted up, they want to push other people down. So these are the people often, I think, you see a lot of like social media pylons where people are trying to get others fired. They're trying to get them canceled. They call them names. This is a much darker behavior. A lot of it's geared at seeking status and being thought of as morally important and morally great. It's just a different way of getting there. And it involves destroying people, destroying your opponents. And it turns out a lot of people who grandstand for dominance are doing it. There's a high correlation between narcissistic antagonism, which is a very sort of dark suite of psychological traits. And it's also much rarer in what we've found in the studies Justin mentioned with Josh Grubbs. Grandstanding for prestige is very common. I mean, if you're scrolling through Twitter or Facebook, like you're probably seeing dozens of instances like in an hour. Grandstanding for dominance is a little less common, although, the moment we're in right now, this is like the end of June 2020, this moment is, it seems to be ripe for a lot of dominance grandstanding, a lot of cancellations, a lot of really nasty moral talk for whatever reason. And so those are the two main ways that you can think about what people are doing, these very natural desires, in many contexts, very morally innocent desires for status. One way to think about grandstanding is just the way that these desires work themselves out in public discourse. I think it's a really helpful way to think about what you're seeing. It gives you a way to categorize and classify like some of this behavior, like some of this sort of self-serving behavior is very, very preening, very look at me, look how great I am, a lot of I talk. And then a lot of grandstanding that's like, you are the worst person ever, do not ever show your face in public.
That's the one that's so scary, and I think the one that a lot of people are concerned about because it's intimidating. Yeah. And you guys have referred to this metaphorically that these sorts of folks use morality as a weapon. And they use it as a weapon in order to, and this is also, I found this compelling as an explanation. It's something I've thought about as well. You used Nietzsche's concept of will to power and this idea that people seek power and that many of the sorts of people that engage in the kinds of behavior that we're talking about here, this kind of moral grandstanding to dominate others, do it as a kind of hack, a workaround, because they can't obtain power through normal means, and so they subversively seek it by trying to dominate others in this type of a way. And I found that to be, that to me made a lot of sense. I'm curious, can you speak to that a bit more? Like, for example, are you familiar, you must be familiar with the case of Evergreen State College with the students?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, like, that's you could take that one and run with it. That was a really scary situation. And I also wonder, and now we're kind of going everywhere. I'm taking us everywhere, but I'm just kind of, I'm curious about what kind of mental hack, what kind of like virus has invaded our brains that has disallowed us or disempowered us from being able to fight back against individuals who are clearly behaving in an amoral and aggressive manner.
That's great. So I want to talk about Nietzsche, and then Brandon, you can talk about the virus. So
I will diagnose humanity. Yeah.
I'll give you a little time. So for the Nietzsche uninitiated, this guy has a bad reputation, or at least did maybe 15 years ago when I first started reading him. Was it that long ago? Oh my God. Anyway, he's actually an extremely interesting thinker. People have tried to associate him with some really nasty historical movements like National Socialism. This is in fact his sister. He had nothing to do with this. He thought that anti-Semites were really pathetic people. Anyway, that's all just to make you a little softer on old Friedrich Nietzsche. So Demetri, you refer to this idea of the will to power. So the will to power is Nietzsche's idea that people really like to feel effective, like they're accomplishing something, like they're encountering obstacles and they overcome them, and it makes them feel alive. It makes them feel invigorated. So we have a sort of love-hate relationship with these obstacles that let us feel powerful, because on the one hand, we need them. If we don't have any obstacles, there's nothing for us to overcome. But we also hate them because they frustrate our desires. They make it difficult for us to get that feeling of having accomplished something. So, a lot of people go ahead and, find a way to overcome their obstacles anyway, and they do fine. But, some people struggle, right? Like me. So what do those people do? I mean, sometimes they just feel frustrated, but Nietzsche says, another thing you can do is get creative. Find some other way of declaring yourself victorious without actually accomplishing anything. So this is, in his work, the most prominent example of this is the slave revolt in morality, which is Nietzsche's telling a bunch of weak people making their weakness into a virtue and making strength into a vice, that they can shame. And so they transvaluated. There's a transvaluation of values, or sometimes translated a revaluation of values. And so as a result of this, weak people were able to feel strong by going after these powerful nobles. So anyway, all this is a long setup to say this is kind of, you might think, what's going on with a lot of grandstanding. People are using these tools of moral talk to take down powerful people through sort of specious means, right? So they invent sort of creative, trumped up charges and get enough other weak people to believe them and act like it's a big deal. And then all of a sudden, they've got 50 years of recent history of people violating this new made up moral rule, and they can go after all of those people. Or, they don't even have to make up a moral rule. They can just tighten the standards, right? So anything that even hints at bad behavior is now grounds for cancellation. So what people are doing, then you might think, when they engage in dominance grandstanding, is they're using moral talk as a weapon. Like you said, Demetri, they are turning these tools on targets that they really shouldn't be aimed at, and taking them down with them. And as a result, they're getting this rush of feeling like they've accomplished something, but it's an empty accomplishment.
Well, I had it's interesting you said your early comments about Nietzsche. I had a positive experience learning about him early on. Well, I guess he also kind of depressed me, but I think
he'll do that. Yeah,
I think I didn't read him properly in the beginning. But Nietzsche was and I studied under remotely. I actually went to NYU, but I studied Nietzsche under Robert Solomon, the late Robert Solomon, and Kathleen Higgins remotely through the great courses. It was a wonderful course. And Robert was so passionate about Nietzsche. Yeah. He really loved him. And Nietzsche was very concerned about virtue, And I think this is also something that comes up in reading your book, and it's so important. And this kind of brings us back to a point that you guys raised earlier, and something that I really want to focus on, which is distinguishing between moral talk that is altruistic, or for the purpose of actually coming to some deeper, more profound, meaningful sense of morality, and grandstanding. And so maybe the next appropriate place to go here is to really understand I mean, we talked about it a little bit, but how do we know if someone is grandstanding? Because you guys make another great point in the book, which is that, this is a theory of mind conversation. And by the way, plug for people that haven't heard our episode with Patrick Grimm on mind-body philosophy. If you're interested in mind-body theory, you can go listen to that episode if you're not convinced by the proposition that we can't know what's in other people's heads. But people seem to think today that they can intuit what's going on in everyone's head. But of course they can't. This is sort of a problem, right? So how do we know if someone is morally grandstanding? How do we identify it in the wild? Is context important? How important is it, for example, that I know the person? So I know, hey, I know Susie's full of shit. I know that she actually doesn't care about this and she's just grandstanding. What does it take to know if someone's grandstanding?
It's very difficult to know. So we compare grandstanding to other phenomena. So think about lying. Grandstanding is like lying in this very limited respect. You can't tell whether someone is lying just by looking at what they say. Why? Well, because to lie requires something like a desire, an intention. You're wanting to mislead or deceive someone. And that is, as you rightly note, that's hidden to the outside world. Sometimes it's even hidden to ourselves. But we definitely don't have access to that. And this is why in controlled studies, humans are barely better than the flip of a coin at telling whether someone is lying. And that's when the person is like standing in front of you and you get to look at like their body language and stuff. So imagine like just looking on Twitter or something and like trying to figure out what's in someone's head. Now, so lying is very difficult. I mean, think about bragging, demagoguery, philosophers talk about bullshit. These are all different phenomena that require something to go a certain way in your head. And we just don't have easy access to those things. So then the question is, well, how do you know someone's grandstanding? And sometimes you just don't. I mean, there are, in the book we give some sort of like contextual clues that help you at least see the kinds of forms that grandstanding can take. So, for example, grandstanders are often making their moral talk about themselves. When they're not really, like, we might be discussing like, trans rights, or might be discussing immigration, but somehow the conversation always keeps coming back to themselves. That's a kind of tell. Or, for example, a lot of grandstanders begin their grandstanding with a kind of like introduction that involves mentioning a credential, like as someone who has long fought for the poor, or as someone who loves this country. There's a Demetri Martin joke about 10 years ago. He had a Comedy Central special, and he said, when someone's introduces themselves as a taxpayer, they're about to be an asshole. And why are they an asshole? Well, they're an asshole because it's pretty obvious what they're doing is sort of like drawing some sort of attention to themselves as some sort of like unique oracle or something about whatever they're about to say after being a taxpayer. So those are a couple of tells. I mean, in the book, we say a lot of grandstanding involves piling on, joining in on a social pile-on, maybe even just attaching your views to the moment, trying to look like you're one of the gang. Some grandstanding takes the form of what we call ramping up, which you nicely mentioned earlier about, it kind of looks like a moral arms race where, you might say, we need to reform the police. And I say, oh, this guy doesn't care about the police. Everyone needs to know how much I care about fixing this. And I say, well, we need to defund the police. And then Justin shows up like 24 hours later on Twitter and says, screw all of you. We need to totally abolish police, like the entire country. So, some people might actually believe that, but one way we might have gotten to that point is by a certain kind of ramping up where in order to look morally impressive and stand out, you have to outdo other people. Grandstanding often takes that form. Grandstanding often looks like, yeah, go ahead.
And I was going to say, and to prove your commitment to the cause.
Right. That's right.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. It's pretty hardcore. I mean, yeah, it's one way to send a signal that like you're not messing around, that you really are serious about this.
I mean, it incentivizes radicalization, right? I mean, so this is like another question, which is one of the macro phenomena or implications of this that society becomes radicalized?
Yeah, so this is one of, and perhaps the most serious of the social consequences of grandstanding that we talk about. This is also something that is borne out in our social science studies. So we found that there's really no partisan divide about grandstanding. That is, if we know someone is liberal or conservative, Republican or Democrat, we don't know that they're more or less likely to grandstand. But people who are on the partisan extremes are more likely to grandstand. So what we take from that is that we think it's support for this story that people who are out to gain prestige within their in-group will try to outmaneuver one another and engage in this moral arms race of just trying to find the most extreme position they possibly can that will gain them approval of the group. An old Louis C.K. joke, the meal doesn't stop when I'm full, it stops when I hate myself. So for grandstanders, this is how moral talk works. It doesn't stop. You don't stop adopting more extreme positions when you've arrived at the truth. You stop adopting more extreme positions when the group is just not going to give you any credit any longer for going even further. So it's not a truth-sensitive process. It's a prestige-seeking process. And this is a disaster if, the point of moral talk is to arrive at the truth. Now, to anticipate like the most obvious objection, a lot of people hear this and say, oh, you guys just don't like, the far left. So we hear this a lot from academics, of course. But the thing to keep in mind is it's not as if it's just your side doing this, right? It's both sides, right? Both sides are engaged in this moral arms race. They're both becoming polarized and more extreme. And not only are they adopting more extreme, just ideological views about what we ought to do, they're also becoming more and more opposed to each other in the sense that they hate each other, right? So, we cite some figures in the book that, something like 40% of people on each side think that the other side politically is downright evil. And something like 20% of people think that the country would be better. These are, numbers in America. The country would be better if a bunch of people on the other side just died. So
Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, whatever you think of the truth, like actually being extreme or not, this is not good.
Yeah.
We've seen there's just like so many examples of this phenomenon that Justin talks about. I'll just mention a few just very recently. So we went from like about 48 hours, we went from reform the police to totally eliminate the police. We went from,
and it was not only that; it was all along. It was
all along. Yeah. Oh, of course. That's what we meant all along. Years ago, we were arguing this.
Well, Bill de Blasio I think he's pushing now to defund the New York City Police Department by $1 billion from 6 to 5.
Yeah.
So how does that, it's so asinine. I mean, if you want to fix the problem, then just reallocate that money towards police training or something. But,
yeah,
it's so asinine.
Yeah. I mean, and it's also, I don't think it's sensitive to the data about
Demetri. Everything in the 70s is going to be cool again.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, so
what were you saying, Brandon, about the data?
Oh yeah, so if it's not even sensitive to the data. I mean, as far as what I understand about the data about policing and funding is that increased funding is actually what makes police departments healthier because they can hire better trained people, they can provide more training, they can provide more cops, and so it's like the exact opposite thing that if you really wanted to help. This is something we talk about in the book, is like sometimes there are policies that look like they satisfy your moral values. They express your moral values, but oftentimes they totally run contrary to what would actually help. There's another great case of about ramping up recently. We went from, again, in a matter of a few days, we went from let's take down Confederate statues in the South, okay. And then like 3 days later, there's an activist named Sean King on Twitter. He said, we need to take down every image of Jesus that is white. So it's like, okay, so we're like,
and it was only they're leaving room for growth. It was only statues
and murals
and stained glass windows. Murals are next, and then
yeah. So we're gonna like paint over the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. We're taking down the Pietà. And then this happens on the right too. So we went from like, oh, masks don't really help, and then some people on the right, like on talk radio and cable news, are saying like, if you wear a mask, you're like part of the conspiracy to like take down the state. You're part of the deep state, and like you've been cowed into fear. And it's like that happened in a matter of a week or two. That like we went from masks don't work to if you wear a mask, you're like trying to take down the country. So, and it's hard to understand these behaviors if you're just looking at them and thinking like, oh, these people are like, the only mechanism at play is like they're trying to figure out the truth. Like if that's your only tool in your toolbox, this behavior will be totally mysterious and puzzling. But if you have this tool in your toolbox that's like, well, people really want status and we really care what people think and like we want to outdo each other with how impressive we look, a lot of these behaviors are made much more. I mean, in one sense, they're not easy to understand, but at least there's a mechanism for understanding how people end up saying these kinds of things.
Well, to the point about, and also, yeah, I agree with everything you said, and we're in a lot of trouble. I don't think people really appreciate how serious this problem is as part of a much larger problem dealing with our information landscape, because I don't really know how we're supposed to address any of our problems if we can't actually have a forum for rational conversation where people don't afraid for their lives or their career, so to speak. But, to your point about the fact that both parties do it, I remember one of the striking observations is that today, what we experience as being primarily a phenomenon driven by the left, this cancel culture, call-out culture, this disingenuous attempt to trip up or find ways to hurt people through social shaming and canceling and everything else, was something that we saw practiced very much from the right during the Bush years, specifically around support for the troops.
Soft on terror,
not loving America. And there was really no clear way to navigate it, because if someone said, well, don't you love our troops? Don't you support our troops? What are you supposed to say? Yes, I support the troops, but... Well, there's no but. You either support the troops or you don't. You love America or you leave it. And it's a way of stifling debate, and it's a dishonest tactic used by malicious actors. And these people are malicious. They're malicious whether they're coming from the left spectrum or whether they have, rightish flavor. They're still malicious. They're bad actors, and their motivations and intentions are not good. And I think that, again, brings us back to this delineation between grandstanding and moral talk, because your intentions matter. They matter fundamentally. So why is moral talk, or the capacity to have moral conversations in public, important? Guys, let's begin to answer that, and then I want to move us into the overtime for the second half, for the second hour. I wouldn't be surprised if we actually go longer than that, because you guys are philosophers. We could probably go for like another 10 hours.
Hey, we're here for it, man.
So yeah, but why don't we start that, and then we'll move into the second hour in the overtime. We can continue.
So why is moral talk so important?
Why is it important to be able to have conversations from a place of good intention with an objective to actually come to some determination about what we believe, what is good, what is bad, things like this, traditional moral philosophy?
Well, I'll just say one thing real quick, and then I think Justin probably has a lot more to say. So one thing that grandstanding does, and we don't talk about this in the book, is that it makes it really hard for people to express heterodox views or to change their mind, come out and just say, look, here's a problem with my side, right? There's just certain kinds of conversations that are absolutely vital if you want to have a vibrant public discourse where people can feel free to speak their mind and provide evidence. But when the incentives are almost entirely motivating people to do things out of fear, like to be silent, or to even modify their views because they're afraid. I mean, one thing we know from various studies is that people will actually say things and enforce norms, punish people for things that they don't even believe are wrong, but because they're afraid to be seen as being a black sheep. And so when there's this context where so much of what people are saying is motivated by what's going to get me canceled, what's going to get me blocked, what's going to get me praise and kudos, people are not interested in challenging the views of their own tribe. Like, it's really difficult to, like, in front of your team say, hey guys, I think we went too far. That's not something that's often safe to say. Or, it's often not safe to say things like, hey, I think maybe this other side has a point here, or let's think about this heterodox view. Is there some merit to this? That's just not allowed. And even worse, to even like come out and just change your mind about something. I mean, so much of what's vital about public discourse is coming to mutual understanding, each of us bringing the little knowledge or the little evidence that we have, doing our part to sort of bring it to the commons, to share it. And so much of that is just not happening because people are either afraid to speak their minds, or they only say things that they believe will get them moral credit in the social square.
Yeah, they're very aggressive. I mean, I don't know if you guys saw today, Terry Crews is trending. Because he broke with the party line.
Yeah, well, he broke it. I'm
not saying he actually brought, I'm not even saying,
it's like,
who even knows what the party line is? This is also part of the problem, right? Like, it's constantly shifting. Like, definitions are shifting before, every single day, there's something else that I found out that I shouldn't have said. You know?
Yeah, so Terry Crews said something like, we need to be careful to not turn Black Lives Matter into Black Lives Are Better, something like that.
Yeah,
right?
I think that's correct.
And he just got pummeled. He's getting dragged because, well, I'm not exactly sure. The tweets that I saw were sort of like, hey, like, you're not helping the cause, What's the story there?
You're off message, sure. Terry. You're off message, Terry. Get on message.
Yeah.
So the things, Brandon's talking about are all right. And actually, I should say, if you're interested in those issues, we have a kind of sequel paper, which you really only get, the most out of if you've read the book. But we have a paper called Moral Grandstanding as a Threat to Free Expression, where we talk about how grandstanding interferes with a lot of the things that are just the point of free expression. But let me stress one more thing, and it's that when grandstanding comes to dominate public discourse, you sort of take the brakes off of whatever direction the bus is headed in. There's no way to stop it, right? Because you can't criticize your own side. The other side's evil, so you can't listen to them. So the only direction that people can gain any status, or at least not risk being ostracized from it, is to go even more extreme. So you'll hear people say things to someone like Terry Crews, like, you're not helping the cause, because people only see straight ahead. Yeah, well, they see both of those things, which sort of defeats the message there. But
well, they also probably hate Terry because he's successful. That's so much of this has nothing to do with the causes. They just have to do with miserable people being angry.
Yeah, right. We need new leadership, and who could that be?
Although that is interesting, and we'll actually keep that for the overtime to have a conversation about that, about leadership, because I do think another kind of issue across the board, regardless of what we're debating, is the lack of leadership in society. It's almost reminds me of Ithaca when Odysseus had left, or all of the city-states after the Greeks left for the Trojan War, where it was all just the suitors running rampant. It's like there's no one there to lay down the law, and it's total disarray.
Yep, the grown-ups are gone, and if they were here, we wouldn't listen to them.
Yeah, exactly. So guys, listen, I'm going to move the second half of this conversation into the overtime. For regular listeners, you know the drill. If you're new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener-supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to our premium content, which includes transcripts of every conversation we've ever had on the program, including this one, copies of my rundown, which are elaborate show documents created by me ahead of every episode, or if you just can't get enough of the podcast and you want to hear more from my guests, head over to patreon.com/Hidden Forces and subscribe. Not only is the content worth it, but it's a way of showing your support for the show and the work we do. Guys, stick around. We're going to move the second half of our conversation into the overtime, where we're really going to get loose. We're going to roll up our sleeves and whip out the nachos. I've got nachos here for myself. I don't know if you guys... So stick around. Today's episode of Hidden Forces was recorded in New York City. For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to overtime segments, episode transcripts, and show rundowns full of links and detailed information related to each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website or through our Patreon page at patreon.com/Hidden Forces. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.